Be careful, there's something swimming in the sewers. Here's your look at McFarlane Toys, DC Multiverse, Batman Arkham Asylum, Killer Croc. Born with a rare mutation that made his skin green and scaly and grew his body to grotesque proportions, Waylon Jones was raised by an abusive aunt and bullied relentlessly for his appearance. He briefly worked as a carnival freak under the name Killer Croc, but his misanthropy grew, as did his bestial nature, pushing him to a life of crime. As his physical condition and mental state deteriorate, Killer Croc becomes more bestial foe, increasingly detached from humanity. Before we look at a pretty cool-looking Croc, how about the first thing we actually do is figure out how tall the figure stands. Taking it right to the very top of his head, Killer Croc impressively is at 8.5 inches in height, or the figure's roughly 21.5 centimeters tall. Now, if you're going to compare it to a pretty big figure, you'll probably want to also bring in some pretty big-looking figures. So, here's what Killer Croc looks like next to Man-Bat. Man-Bat, unfortunately, is starting to develop some really loose ankles. Here's what the figure also looks like next to Clayface. And in both the cases of Man-Bat and Clayface, Killer Croc is about that same size, give or take. You know, he's a little bit taller than Clayface. Seems like he's just a little bit shorter, though, than Man-Bat. And obviously, because he's from an Arkham game, let's bring in an Arkham Batman. Now, this is an Arkham Asylum Batman, but this is one I actually like a lot more. I think this is Arkham City Batman. But still, you can see that in this case, Batman goes to about the elbows of Killer Croc, which, basing it from the models pulled from the game, I think that's roughly about right. The things that come included with Killer Croc aren't much. In fact, the figure only comes included with a trading card and only comes included with a display stand, which seems to be pretty, again, consistent with other larger-sized DC Multiverse figures we've looked at before. Trading card, yes. Display stand, yes. First, though, looking at the trading card actually is using source material, not a figure photo. In this case, you can kind of see their colors aren't quite the same. The Killer Croc figure actually gets more closer to a mint green, where this Killer Croc definitely has a lot more darker, dingier looking blacks and greens. Kind of wish the color scheme was a little bit more closer to this. Still, though, on the back, it also gives you the real name of Waylon Jones. You can either pause and read that for yourself. It also happens to be the same thing, yes. Yeah, I know, you know what I was going to say. It's the same thing I read also at the beginning of this video. You don't even have to read that for yourself. The figure also comes included with a display stand. Unlike, though, Man-Bat, Killer Croc so far, knock on wood, I don't really have any, well, I have somewhat wood for the desk. Knock on wood, the figure doesn't have yet loose ankles, and I hope that's not certainly going to be something that's going to be a case down the road. Has the same DC logo printed down below. Psst. And he has one singular stand peg off to the side here that can attach to either one of the figure's feet. The figure does have slightly loose ankles, but the way that these feet are at least built, he makes for a much easier to stand figure. That being said, let's go ahead and pick up Killer Croc. Color scheme aside, that's the one thing I wish the figure could have done a better job, I think, doing. Again, we're going to bring back in the card. Thank goodness in this case we actually have a source material photo to use. Killer Croc, notably, I think, is a lot darker in the game, and you see a lot more different colors being used here on the original model, where you've got like darker green here for the shoulders, kind of more of that silver color that they've got here for the chest area, and again, like he's got more of like a darker kind of swamp green for his arms. You don't get as much happening here for Killer Croc, which is sadly just the case that they've used really more just a green plastic. Now, it is colored nicely to their credit, but I don't think it's colored as closely resembling to the original model from the video game. Again, I like the colorings, and I think the actual sculpting of the skin is really quite good on this. You got these little irregular bumps, ridges, and scales, all kind of irregular and different from one another. That you never really look at this and feel like you're just simply seeing the same pattern work, literally just pressed across the figure. I don't know why I'm using that with my hand. But you got these nice little scales that are sticking up. Those are stripped with a darker green. And then you kind of got these lighter greens and lighter sections. But still, again, I wish that the colors were a little bit more darker. A real contrast where you got the really dark colors happening here. But again, you got a lot of the same kind of greens happening. Head sculpt-wise, I'm actually pretty happy with it. There are a few little things, like one of which being I kind of wish that the mouth could have actually opened and closed. I mean, it kind of teases you a little bit that there's almost a carved-in section here on the side of his mouth that for one split second, when I took this figure first out of the packaging, I thought, oh, does he actually have a jaw that opens? And not sadly the case. Something else that's unfortunately omitted on my figure is, I believe, pupils. Killer Croc should have, I think, pupils actually on his eyeballs. And unfortunately, in this case, while they are nicely painted in yellow, they are sadly lacking in the pupil department. Again, you've got the nice dark green happening here on the top. I do like the way they've actually shadowed the sections of his eyes, so at least it helps to make those eyes pop a lot more. And to be fair, there's some decent color happening here with some nice shiny black, representing these little spikes that are sticking out not only the sides of his face, but the bottom of his chin as well. Now, he does have the neck collar piece. The neck collar, from what I can see, is not removable. I guess you could probably pry this off, but I mean, like, why would you want to? Why would you even want to? Just leave it on there. He does also have shackles there on the bottoms of his legs. He doesn't have it on his arms, but he does have at least like these kind of leather-wrapped kind of gauntlets that he's got on the sides of his forearms here. And that brings a nice little bit of extra coloring added in there as well. He's got some decently sculpt, not sharp, mind you, but they almost certainly look like they could carve into skin. These sharp, sticking out fingernails. Very, very nicely done on McFarlane's part. Again, you got some decent sculpting on the inside of it. But again, like the coloring that they use for the green is just a little bit off. I mean, if that doesn't bother you, I mean, it's a nice looking figure. If you are one that wants to be more of a stickler and it has to so closely resemble the video game source material, yeah, the color is a bit off here on Killer Croc. Then he does have his pants here, which as you can see, they're tied off here by rope. The thing, though, about the legs, now this lower half here, by the way, is like that softer plastic that they would have used. Now this does a pretty good job of actually hiding the joint at the top of the thigh. It does give some problems, though, when it comes to moving his legs about. I mean, splitting the legs isn't so much the issue, but say if you did want to bring like the legs a little bit forward, it does push really hard against this softer plastic. And when you end up moving the legs back, I've only done this a couple of times, but I've noticed like there's a gap. Now that gap may have already been there at the time that I took the figure first out of his plastic tray, but I've noticed like there's a bit of a gap spaced between the leg and of course the lower half of his torso, all because they're using that softer plastic. At least, you know, to its credit, it hides the joints decently enough. Plastic doesn't quite match color wise, I mean, because it looks like they painted here the legs, and then obviously they would have just molded this in the brown plastic. It's not quite the same, but it's pretty close. And then of course you've got the bottoms of his legs, kind of more of a dingier, darker, grimier looking brown that they've added in there as well. Just kind of add some nice wear and tear to it. Now the feet, I'm going to talk a little bit about the articulation in a few moments, but I did notice right out of the packaging that his tootsies, his toes here, are really loose on articulation. Ankles aren't so much the issue, but like this is not something that's going to necessarily affect the standing of Killer Croc, but I did notice like his feet were a little more on the looser side. I took him out of the plastic. Anyways, though, for the articulation here for Killer Croc, his head is on a ball joint in theory. I mean, yeah, you can rotate it all the way around. But because the neck, I'm going to just kind of have it tilted side. I'm going to show you from the sideways here. The neck goes this way. It doesn't go up. If it went up like this, in theory, you would be able to hinge the head a lot higher than what you could. Because, though, the neck goes this way, sticking out, it means that when it comes to lifting his head, that's about all you can really do. And every single time I try to actually lift it up, it wants to kind of drop back down to its neutral state. Again, you can kind of rock it back and forth. You can have the head looking down only just by a little bit. But like the collar piece does also get a little bit in the way of things too. I mean, even if you were to, in theory, take the collar piece off, I don't think it would have at all improved the articulation because there's very little to work with here from the head because the head is so close to that ball joint. As for the shoulders do come out. This one arm is a little on the more looser side, but certainly not a deal breaker. You can rotate the arms all the way around. He does have only just a single hinge, which seems to be the case with a lot of these mega-sized figures. And he does also have a rotation in the forearm. Hands rotate also all the way around. You can also hinge those back and forth. He has an upper torso ball joint. He also has a lower torso ball joint. The legs split out on a ratcheted joint. You can take the legs and move them forward and back, but again, like, seems to be developing a little bit of a loose gappage. I hate really when that happens. A little bit of gappage right there. He does have a double hinge on the knee, which actually was a pleasant surprise to see. Not that you really would be able to get him in a leaping pose, because there's really no means to actually have him just bouncing on one leg. That would be different and awkward, certainly on Killer Croc. I don't really know why you necessarily need to have a double hinge on the knee. I appreciate the fact he does actually have that much articulation, but it's not something that you could actually, I mean, I guess in theory, I mean, I keep saying in theory, but in theory, really, I guess you could make use of that double hinge on the knee by actually having him more lunging forward. So I take that back. Good that they actually did put in double hinge joints on his knees. And then when it comes to his ankles, the lower end of the cuff of his leg sort of does eliminate any bit of rocking back and forth for his ankle. You can only just barely feel as if something's moving there. But you can also move it up and down that way, so at least that's something. And as we already discussed, he does have slightly loose toes. Tootsies. You move back and forth. Who says tootsies? Old people say tootsies. I'm an old person. Still, though, it's a nice looking figure. I mean, if you don't mind the fact that the coloring really isn't that close to the video game, I mean, they clearly went with more of a lighter coloring. That doesn't bother me really at all. I'm going to bring Batman back in for comparisons here. Sizes. Size-wise is good. Articulation is decent. And Sculpt is actually good on this as well. There's only like a few little things, kind of wishing that maybe perhaps his mouth could have opened a little bit of jaw articulation. And again, I noticed on mine, it doesn't have pupils painted. That may be also across the board too, and not just solely be mine. But he's a good size Croc. He's a good Croc that fits in until we eventually get maybe an ultimate killer Croc. But this one actually does pretty good of a killer Croc if you're just looking for one to put on a shelf, filling out the rest of Batman's rogues. Generally, when you're picking up figures, things you'll be checking off to look at are sculpting, articulation, and paint applications. And I think in those categories, Killer Croc does things pretty good. He's an oversized figure, first of all, so that's one thing I really like about the size and the stature of him. You, of course, will want to get a Killer Croc that's a lot bigger than a Batman, and Killer Croc checks that box off nicely, too. The sculpting on the scales of his skin are actually quite good. The coloring that they used, even though, again, not most video accurate in colors, the colors that they chose are at least pretty good for Killer Croc. At least to his credit, he's got the lighter colors on the front of his chest, and he's got the darker colors on the back of his torso, so at least he does things well there. Articulation is, yes, something that probably could have been fixed ever so slightly. One thing I have noticed, and I didn't really talk too much about it in the review, is by not having the ankle articulation where you could sway it back and forth, you can't always get him in a successful pose of actually having his leg slightly bent. You may notice the one leg that's off to the side, the one that's not actually attached to a display stand, you can't obviously bend the ankle. So because of that, his foot just sort of sticks out to the side. Kind of wish that he did have maybe better articulation in the ankles where you could rock those back and forth, so give him a little bit more stable footing. Other than that, I mean, I really like the way that this one turned out. I don't know what likelihood there's going to be for a Killer Croc down the road. Is this a character that really warrants to get a second release? I mean, he's not a Batman. He's not even a Joker. I mean, when you're looking at a C-tier character, no offense to Killer Croc, is that enough to warrant maybe McFarlane Toys to re-release this guy either as like a gold label with a slightly different paint applications or just to give us another Killer Croc? I don't know. Could be slim to none. This may be the chance to get yourself a Killer Croc if you're looking to add one to your collection shelf, whether it be collecting the DC Multiverse figures or whether it be to collect the Batman video game tied-in characters. Either way, it's a pretty good-looking Killer Croc. Few little nitpicks, but certainly not enough to be a deal-breaker at all. What do you guys think of Killer Croc? Let me know down below in the comments section. And if you enjoyed this video, hit it with a like. If you're loving the content you're seeing and certainly want to stick around for more, then make sure you hit the subscribe button down below and turn on the bell notification. Popping up, by the way, at the very end of this video will also be a playlist of all the other DC Multiverse reviews that I've looked at up to now, and all future videos will also be showing up in those playlists also. Keep your peepers peeled, because while we have wrapped up the review right now for the Arkham Asylum Killer Croc, there's definitely going to be a lot more DC Multiverse reviews coming your way. As always, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.